Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the convener of this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and application of the social capital concept. And if you're interested in joining, you can check out information on our website. In this session, we welcome Dr. Garrett Brogan for a presentation titled Weaving Together Social Capital to Empower Women Artisan Entrepreneurs. Garrett Brogan is a PhD, or successful PhD candidate, I hear, very recently, at Texas A&M University, studying agricultural leadership education and communications, while emphasizing international agriculture development. He completed his bachelor's degree at Utah State University in International Agribusiness. His current research focuses on women's empowerment in developing countries through artisan goods, agriculture, and policy change. He has development experience across Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and he's lived abroad in East Africa for volunteer mission trips and research expedition. He loves exploring the great outdoors, running and traveling. Garrett, we're delighted you've agreed to give this webinar to hear the results of your PhD research. So over to you for the presentation.
Awesome. Howdy, and thank you for allowing me to present some of the research that I've been able to work on over the last couple of years. And so really like what I'm wanting to share more about today is just how women and how through their entrepreneurship, we're able to use social capital to gain access to better economic empowerment, both for themselves, their families, and then their communities. So just a little background before is the artisan sector. One of the things that I specifically love when I traveled abroad is interacting with women and other artisan groups. And that kind of is what led me to wanting to pursue this research and trying to understand more about it. Because I noticed different ways artisan goods were being sold, both from perspective in the US of like going to a store versus like in a market, an artisan market, anything like that. And so what I found just from early research as well as just from the literature review, a lot of women were participating and also within the artisan industry were participating in what's called the informal economy. So these are activities that are not specifically recorded, but they actually have market value and add to GDP or tax revenue if they had been recorded as well. They obviously help contribute to a country or a community's economy. But the issue is that a higher percentage of people involved in developing countries are found within this informal economy. So specifically within Sub-Saharan Africa, 86% of the population are found within this informal economy, with 74% of that total population being women. So a large percentage of them found within informal economy are participating in this, which causes some issues because the informal economy lacks like social benefits, safety nets, and other issues compared to like a formal economy that can be developed. And so then another thing that I wanted to understand is I noticed a lot, and it's pretty common across Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of individuals are involved in cooperatives, both the agricultural side to other saving cooperatives, to then as well as artisan cooperatives. And so cooperatives have been one ways groups in the past have sought to develop the informal to more formal. And there's been a lot of focus though more on agriculture. And so I wanted to dive more into how I was how through my travel and also volunteer experience and noticed many women and groups participating in the cooperatives within the artisan industry. So just a little background on the artisan industry. Behind agriculture in developing countries, the artisan sector is the second largest employer in the world. So there are many artisans found in the informal sector for a multitude of reasons, whether it's easier to do from home or just the cultural ties that they have. But because of these developing countries having these, a lot of artisan sectors, along with agriculture, a lot of women do both, or individuals are participating both to be able to provide for themselves and their families. And so there's been a lot of understanding and I guess access to using these individuals and their products, but there's little development in this sector specifically, and also research to understand how fragmented it is and how individuals are still continuing to operate within the informal as compared to there's a lot of development and understanding specifically within agriculture and how the cooperatives are specifically used for this. So obviously I'm talking about social capital. I don't need to dive into that. I just wanted to share how my study and what I did was I used Wilcock and Narian's four views of social capital to really frame my research and to be able to better understand what to do. And so they specifically have four views. Communitarian is the local connections that we have with organizations that specifically bring benefits to us. Networks are the vertical connections to groups outside our organization to help bridge and bridges to both horizontal and vertical connections. The institutions are obviously the institutions within a society that allow individuals to gain better access to social capital. And then lastly, synergy focuses on the linkages between all three views to enhance the capabilities of communities. And so for my study, I use these four views to help frame my research and understanding the impact of these artisan cooperatives. And so there was kind of two parts to my study. First, I found different artisan cooperatives operating across Sub-Saharan Africa and reached out to them. And I first interviewed these different, what I call them as chief entrepreneurship founders that managed these different artisan cooperatives across Sub-Saharan Africa. I interviewed them, which then helped give me better and understanding of what I should do to be able to then launch a more in-person study and research of some of these actual cooperatives. So overall, this was just a phenomenological research which sought to describe both social and economic impacts of women artisan cooperatives on the women entrepreneurs found within these cooperatives. And so specifically part one, again, from the chief entrepreneurship founders, it was just after COVID. And so travel again was restricted. And so I was a little bit still stuck where I was. And some of these chief entrepreneurship founders were across the globe. I conducted semi-structured interviews over Zoom with these different women that happen to be running these different cooperatives. And then I also just looked at their annual reports as well. And through my data analysis, I used constant comparative method to just what was happening found within these cooperatives and from their perspective. And then also after this process, I kept really good fill notes when I did these interviews, along with a reflexive journal of why I did certain things. But then I also referred back to these members because what they told me helped inform both the studies and research that I did later when I went in person. And so my population and sample included, I contacted 10, but was only able to interview 4. But I have 5 included just because the 5th one provided me a lot of information via email with her partner. And so these are just the 5 different CEOs or chief entrepreneurship founders that I interviewed specifically. And again, I give them pseudonyms specifically and where their cooperatives are founded or where they're operating, but they're all operating within Sub-Saharan Africa. And all of them happen to be expats. They happen to have lived in the country for a while and then started these cooperatives, or they happen to have felt a need and wanted to really expand upon. And so from what I found, I had 4 large results from this area that I'll dive into specifically as well. And so specifically for cooperative good, they really wanted to start coming alongside women who are already making items. And they had gone through a specific training program with a local nonprofit that was teaching them different skills. And so a lot of these women just were learning skills that could provide for them. So learning how to sew, learning how to really use scissors, something that some of us may not understand that we learned, in elementary or primary school. And so rather than simply creating a new business, Cooperative Good felt that they should come alongside these women that were already being successful and help be that vertical gap. And so being that social connection, help bridge them to something new. Cooperative Kind started from a village as a ground up training and education nonprofit to help assist women to provide for both themselves and their families. And so women are now actual employees of the cooperative and are paid a salary instead of just simply doing piecework. And so again, that's two just differences between those two cooperatives. And then SEE, Social Enterprise Empower, was unique in that it operates somewhat like as a university. And so the women come and work in the artisan sector where they create beautiful recycled cow horn jewelry. And then at the same time, they learn about business skills and training, which then they earn money that goes into an account to eventually save towards their own future businesses. So they could decide to stay in the artisan sector, or they could start their own local businesses. And this just helped them grow the first of skills, also help them really have the capital as well to be able to be successful entrepreneurs in the future. The next key theme was key partnerships. And so Cooperative Good specifically has an existing partnership with that nonprofit training program, which allowed them to gain access to the women artisan entrepreneurs. And so since then, they have found companies for their products, which have helped continue to build relationships with other artisans across the country they operate in, and it's also helped them expand their product line. Specifically, like they were able to start a woven earring that became quite popular on their website, and they specifically are selling jewelry, and that's what their emphasis is on. And so a lot of these women were already doing it and so had learned it, and then they were able to expand across not just the women working this nonprofit, but other artisans across the country. Cooperative Kind has built key partnerships both locally and internationally. They worked with other artisans and further expanded their production. And what my research, when I'll discuss a little bit about them later, but they started again in a village and then they expanded to another larger city, and then they soon then expanded to another village that was even further away, where women were participating in different, doing more basket weaving versus they were doing more sewing in the village that they started in. And so they've been able to connect their products to other larger companies like doTERRA, for example, and through this, then they've been able to teach the women and help all groups involved through greater economic impact. And so they've specifically emphasized on more than simply just giving a job, but helping provide other things as well. Social enterprise really pounded the pavement when I interviewed them to build partnerships along the West Coast. So they, again, were doing earrings and with that recycled cow horn, and they wanted to help expand that. So they did lots of social media blitzes, but then they were determined to really help expand their cooperative, and through they drove a bus all along the West Coast and went to multiple venues and parties where they were just telling more about the impact of that their cooperative and how they were providing for women. So, doing a lot of social goods, using their social connections to be able to expand what they could provide to the women, rather than the women just simply selling. Then the other thing was benefits or impacts of the cooperative, and this was my favorite part. Hearing from the CEFs of helping them share their stories of what they were witnessing, the changes within the artisan women working within the cooperatives. So Cooperative Good really is seeking to provide sustainable employment for the women involved, and because of this, many of them have become breadwinners within their family. A lot of them really were helping provide for their family, building new places, increasing their standard of living. And they were able also, on top of just not the economic gain, but they're also able to learn some other skills. So they have been doing different holistic training programs that talk about nutrition or women's health, or other things that may be pertinent to their culture specifically. And so it's really that holistic process of not just paying them or providing a job for them, but also providing them instruction, opportunity to grow within themselves and as well within their families. Cooperative Kind specifically has 4 pillars that they seek to unleash greatness within their artisans and their communities. Those are the economic, spiritual, social, and environmental. And so again, they are doing more than just providing a job, but they are providing a place for their artisans to grow. And so what this looks like is lots of times, again, similar. They do nutrition training programs. They've done a lot of different saving programs, helping them understand how what they should do with their money to be better effective, saving for the future and what that looks like. As well as they've done a lot of just other fun things that you may have at your normal office as well that help provide just a better social environment for their artisans, such as Crazy Sock Day, or also I remember they did a Halloween party that the CEO told me about. And so this is through, again, that holistic programming that helps to build them not just as provide a job, but also help build them as women. And so one of my favorite quotes from Brittany that she shared, and I love what she shared, is when she was there for a time, she said that as they were sitting around the table making jewelry all day, but were laughing the whole time. I think about that in terms of art longevity, and think about how much this laughter is adding to their days. So not only simply going to work and what maybe in a lot of developing countries may seem is factory, but these women are actually going to work, helping provide for themselves, but also like participating in these holistic programs, as well as maybe getting food or other things that we may think of as those social benefits that come from a job that are found within the formal sector rather than the informal. Then they specifically then talked about change and growth. So cooperative good has moved from just teaching women how to use scissors and a ruler to helping them lead the cooperative, and then training other women on the standards of the cooperative. So they discussed how they were able to tell them how to use scissors, and then these women then were shipping products. They were helping train other new members of what the standards were, so that they could be unison and be able to teach them the skills that they need to be successful. And I loved what they shared in cooperative good of. They had a lot of women that were not only changing themselves, but also sought to change others around them. So some of them were sending their siblings to school. Specifically, a lot of them were sending their sisters to school. They were also like wanting to help include their mothers or other family members within the artisan industry, or providing or teaching them skills that would make them also successful. Cooperative kind also discussed then how many women were hesitant when they started the job originally, because it's hard to understand that it's more than just a job, that the cooperative seeks to provide more than that and helps them to develop with those 4 pillars. And so the women discussed that they are now able to give back to their community through, they conduct service projects, and some of them have even become local leaders within their communities as well, because of the example that they've set from learning at the cooperative. And then SEE shared a lot about fear about what they were teaching the women, like that university, that type of classes that they were teaching these women to be successful business members. And it happened right during the pandemic lockdown. And so they were nervous that these women might not be as successful, but when they were able to finally travel back after they'd taken a break away, they found that a lot of these women businesses were actually thriving, and that they were now even employing more women. So there was one story that they shared about one of the women, one of the artisans that was part of the group. She had started her own hair salon now, and she was now employing 2 other women during what happened after the lockdown, and she was one of the first graduates. And so not only were the women artisans growing from what the CEF shared, but the CEOs were also growing through this process. And so Josie, who had started with just a few women in that rural village, she was able to expand to 100 artisans and staff. She's discussed what her cooperative does isn't really a secret, but she wants to help other women in similar situations, because she recognizes how large the artisan sector is across Sub-Saharan Africa, and how what she is doing can really help provide and change not only the women, but their families and their communities. Brittany and Julie just described how having a partner in hard times allowed them to push each other, and allowed them to get back to the community of women that they specifically were working with. They were each living for times back and forth between the country where the artisan cooperative was operating, and so they were able to then push ideas, and bring another partner allowed them to do challenging things. And lastly, Sierra and Lacey, they were able to grow and trying to help teach these women about running a business, and then also doing it themselves. They were, in a sense, running a business because they were helping sell these products, and then they were helping pound the pavement and really marketing the product that they were trying to sell, so that they could continue like with another cohort and help more women in the area that they were operating get business skills and be able to become their own bosses as well. And so this was just like overall these stories that these women shared with me helped provide a lot of hope and help me understand really what they were doing simply more than providing a job. They were trying to find opportunities to enhance and grow both socially and economically the women they were working with. And so just some brief conclusions and recommendations from that. I determined that like the networks that specifically existed within these artisan cooperatives helped bridge what they were doing to and the women to greater opportunities. So again, like I mentioned, one of the cooperatives was able to partner with a large company operating in the US, while some of the other women were able to use some of their marketing skills and be able to help sell the product versus simply the women just having to go to like a local artisan market and rely upon like tourism, and especially during what was the pandemic, a lot of that would have been hindered. And so I then visited, which I'll dive into now, some two of these cooperatives that I was able to really so the population and sample for this specifically was women working in artisan cooperatives in East Africa. So the two countries were Rwanda and Kenya, and they came from 3 different cooperatives. And the first one is Umutima, and this is the actual name. They wanted me to include this so that they could continue to grow and people could recognize who they were. But Umutima in Rwanda, that there are 15 to 25 women that I worked with there, and they continue to expand. And this one started originally just as a literacy group. They wanted to provide education to a lot of girls that they noticed were having to leave the city to go to a village because they weren't able to provide an education. But then they noticed that even after that, they needed something more. And so then they started this artisan group. Kumera Creative, I was able to work with 5 women there. And they've since then been able to expand as well. But they operated a lot of the women, specifically in that were selling a lot of produce just on the side of the road until then they were able to become part of the cooperative and learn some sewing skills and other skills to be able to then make some goods. And then Imani Collective, which was in Kenya, and so there was 2 locations, one in the village and then one in Old Town Mombasa. And there were 18 to 35, depending on each location, with a total of 88 respondents as well. So for this one, what the CEOs or CFs had told me really impacted what I wanted to understand, specifically from the women's perspective, because that was the idea, was to understand if they were being empowered and really what the social and economic changes were happening. So I used a variety of techniques. So you did a food security and nutrition activity, which I'll kind of dive into next, as well as financial security and stability activities, self-efficacy activity, priority matrix. And all this, I asked questions of what before the cooperative it was like, and then currently with the cooperative what it was. Along with, I was there for a period of a month, doing semi-structured interviews and observations. So this is an example of the food guide activity. And so I combined it into large posters. And what I did is I asked the women to tell me before the cooperative how many times a week they were eating that food group. So that top food group you can see is meat. And so before the cooperative, how many times a week were you purchasing and eating meat? And then the blue dots, then they would then say how many times a week they are doing. So this was not really necessarily quantitative. I did have some basic descriptive statistics, but I really wanted to have a visual picture and see the shift and change from before and after versus just simply asking them. And this allowed them to then discuss more about what was happening with them. It was similar within the financial security activity. So some of these questions that I asked were, how prepared were you before the cooperative and being able to pay for a medical emergency? Another question was, how prepared were you before the cooperative and being able to help family members in need of financial support? And so again, just more visually, I'm trying to understand what that social and economic benefits were for them. And then it went similar to self-efficacy and leadership efficacy of if they believe that they were confident in leading others effectively and what they saw themselves as. And then lastly, if you've never heard of priority matrix, simply just understanding what our priorities are in a group. And so I asked them before the cooperative, what were some of the competing priorities for their time, for their money, and what were some of the issues that they faced? And so a lot of them mentioned different things. And so then as a group, we then go through and kind of do a pairing rank between each of them. So I'd ask them between healthcare and food, what was probably more of a bigger priority? And they would come to just a group consensus of like, this was it. There was never, if there was a tie, we would then just mark that and then come back to it. And then I did this simply as well for afterwards as well. So, for all this data, I had a lot of pictures as well. So I used the constant comparative method to really understand, as well as I had a lot of field notes for the time that I was there. And then the photos really just helped me understand the discussion that was happening, as well as what was happening physically within the property for the observations. And so I largely had 6 main themes that I'll talk about and dive more deeply into. But what I really learned and focused on is really wanting to see the changes, both positively and negatively, that they had because of the impact of the cooperative. And so the first one was, as you kind of noticed, they discussed a lot of changing in their diet. So many of the women discussed that now they were actually eating 3 meals a day. So some of these cooperatives, actually, sorry, all of them, they do a meal program. So at least they do lunch, but some of them also do a breakfast or tea. And so now they were actually eating instead of maybe just eating twice a day or even once a day, depending on some of their situations. And there was growth in actually what their diet consisted of and a variety as well. And then there were large differences between women that were operating in the city versus the village. And so this is just an overall picture as well. And so just some really fun information that I thought was really cool is before the cooperative, a lot of women really rarely ate fruit. So it was usually half a day to around 3 times a week that they maybe would eat some fruit. Versus after the cooperative, it moved to 3.5 to 6 days a week that they were often eating fruit and put it part of their diet. Some of the women mentioned that they just didn't realize also they had economic benefits to be able to purchase it. They also like nutritionally didn't know that like it was a necessary part of their life. Like, it was readily available, but they had taken those nutrition courses and they're cooperative and learned, oh, like I actually need to be eating fruit because of the vitamins and nutrition that it provides for me as well. And then the other interesting thing that I noticed is vegetable consumption in the village. It was 6.2 days a week before the cooperative, but it dropped to 3.4 days a week. And you may think, well, that's not good. But again, it was their diet changes and what they wanted to share. But they talked about how vegetables were a cheap option, and so it's kind of what they were forced into always eating these cheap, not always nutritionally dense vegetables or grains in a sense. And now it had shifted to them being able to purchase more meat as well as other varieties of vegetables that may help them have a variety of diet. And then they also both really big in Rwanda as well as Kenya is milk. They use it for their morning tea, and they really discussed how it was really very cultural. So specifically in Rwanda, the women shared that because before the cooperative, they really knew how destitute they were because they weren't able to have a daily cup of milk. And so this showed them just how poor they were, versus now they were able to like have it whenever they and so then also the change in diet versus village versus city. And so like as these kind of 2 graphs share, a lot of the city had just a greater access to a broader range of food. While in the village, they had less variety, and they saw they all still like increased in their consumption, but a lot of them still didn't have access compared to a larger city that had more access to fruit that was coming from across the country as well. And so I thought this was really interesting and what women in the village were doing to maybe fix some of these issues, and even some of them venturing maybe to a nearby city or what they now were participating in, as well as potentially being enhancing the growth of their own. They also discussed just how their changing diet of cooking. And so what they cooked on also depended on the time and what type of stove they had. So before, a lot of the women were using cheap alternatives, so usually charcoal or paraffin, which usually took a long time. And so they'd only really rarely cooked with this. And so then after the cooperative, some of the women were now able to afford gas cookers, and they also then had a choice between, oh, I can cook these different methods and cook faster, or I can cook it slower, but I have the ability to do so. They also just discussed their changes in family dynamics. And so a lot of the women discussed how socially before the cooperative, they were kind of excluded from conversations about finances and other issues concerning the family with their husbands or with other family members. And now, after being a part of the cooperative, they are included in a lot of these big conversations because they're helping contribute financially towards their house. And so they were able to be more regarded. So this is a positive thing, but also not necessarily a good thing that they were seen only their value being tied specifically to monetary, being able to monetarily contribute to their families, rather than the other social and other things that they contribute as mothers and as wives to their households. And then they also said there was immediate and extended family now seeing them as valuable. Also because of the financial gain and them being able to contribute and potentially help them out. But this again is something of concern, seeing their value simply equated to financial provision. And then lastly, that they were contributing financially to their family. They also then were being asked a lot more by family members to help. So greater pressure to help their family members to be able to provide for different situations or medical emergencies, anything like that. Versus before, obviously, when they weren't participating or contributing as much financially towards their household, they weren't as. The other thing that they discussed was a lot of change in self. And so a lot of them discussed of how they themselves, and so this was a lot through the leadership advocacy, but a lot of them saw how they were able to grow and see and contribute to their community, but they were able to also see themselves as really good mothers and wives, and they had skills and ability to be able to contribute and grow. And so whether that was, I remember meeting with a woman who was able to grow her English speaking skills because of being able to on the job and what she was doing, as well as another one was able to just see herself as being able to contribute not only to her family, but that she was able to contribute to her community as well. They also described this growth in job skills. And so again, like what I shared before, many of us may have grown up potentially of knowing how to use scissors or what a ruler and how to use that. And that was something a lot of the women didn't know. And so a lot of them have grown and enhanced their skills, not only from the basic skills of cutting and measuring, but also of sewing and being able to hand stitch beautiful birds like some of those that are in these pictures. And so a lot of the women learn these things maybe culturally, like the weaving, baskets, or there's some even the sewing, but they're able to perfect these skills and really enhance them as well. And so, for example, Maddie in the top left corner, she was able to use her knowledge of henna tattoos to be able to find a way to fix mistakes from printing on the bags that they were doing in their cooperative at Amani Collective. And so, again, they were able to use skills from their own life and then enhance them within their job as well and use them. Also, social skills. I noticed this when I was there. Women were talking a lot and joking and laughing, and they were able to express themselves with friends. And so I noticed, like, when women would leave work, they were waiting for their friends to be able to leave. And so there was a lot of change within that. And a lot of the women had improved their English skills because of classes offered within the cooperatives, as well as being able to interact with customers and community members and other stakeholders as well. I remember at times when my translator would ask questions in English word when I was there and ask what it was in Swahili, just saying it out loud. Some of the women would then tell her the word that she was looking for. And so a lot of the women were starting to be more confident in their skills because of participating in the cooperative. and being also able to show items they're working on and tell me even more about what they were doing and why they love what they do. Lastly, this kind of goes to self, but there was a lot of confidence and growth in confidence in themselves and as well as what they could do within their families and communities. So this is just a really interesting overall data, but a lot of the women, their self-efficacy, a lot of them increased and they were able to share how they felt after being a part of the cooperative. They understood a lot more and felt more comfortable in being able to lead others as well. And there was a lot of differences as well as in culture. Obviously, it was operating in 2 different countries as well as different socio-economic statuses between village and cities. And so I noticed that with the different women, specifically in Rwanda, as we know, like in 1994, there was a genocide, and so a lot of the women actually had been or had family members apart, had died in the genocide, and so they were quiet and more reserved. But by the end, I noticed that they were more amicable and more willing to share as well. So external self-efficacy is like actually doing something versus internal self-efficacy is believing that you can, but external is walking the walk. And so before Amani Old Town wanted the scale to be higher because a lot of them expressed that they were already confident before, but now they felt they had changed so much that they wanted to be even more confident as well in what their life situations were applying to them. Women express also doubts about how they'd grown up at times and maybe were a little bit naive, and then now like they realize now, and so those doubts may have impacted just how they could be more effective as well. Some even noted that because they had greater knowledge, they felt their scores again were decreasing. And there was, as we can see, there was a little difference between answers from participants, even with those that reported lower scores for how they currently felt. But there were, especially with one of the questions I asked in both groups, which was, how do you feel and your confidence of being able to create, build, and or build a vision to inspire? So again, it was pretty similar of their scores, but again, they still expressed of wanting and wanting to continue to grow their skills of being more confident and to be able to do that. They also described a lot of their physical and mental health, so that change in self, being able to learn from others. So specifically in Rwanda, a lot of the women obviously had PTSD and other trauma that had come from the genocide, and so a lot of them discussed how they now were able to discuss and share more about it as well, and they were able to discuss those priorities, specifically like issues that they may face as women that help them to be able to come together that impacted both their physical and mental health. And they also then being able to work together, they also were able to discuss some of those family and societal and community pressures that they were facing because rather than having to face those. Okay, lastly, the other part was the changing community. And so before the cooperative, a lot of them lacked the social support group and community, and then afterwards, the cooperatives had provided them now with that support. For the cooperatives, a lot of their neighbors and community members really didn't see them as having value, but now they see them as having value, whether that's because of their increased confidence of wanting to participate and be engaged, or also the financial component as well, which is another issue, again, that raises that your value and worth, it shouldn't be tied to the ability to contribute financially to your family or community. But a lot of them are growing communities, so they always hold lunch together. They're doing Bible studies, birthday parties, and other activities, not only within work, but outside work as well. And then lastly, they expressed, again, I was discussing wanting to understand social and economic benefits. So lastly, they described more about their change in finances. And so as you can see, many of the women discussed how they felt more independent and could actually offer help to family members or friends when they needed it. And so we see a large difference between Imani Village and Umutima of them feeling more confident of being able to provide for themselves and their families, save for the future, and what that looked like. As well as many of the women now, because of this, they'd started side businesses. Some of them were using the skills that they learned from the cooperative, such as sewing clothes or weaving baskets, but others were also buying farm animals, starting cosmetic businesses. But they discussed that now that they moved up in a level, I guess, of socioeconomic class, that they kind of had no choice but to do this. They had to kind of compete with their new increased living costs and the demands that were being put upon them, both by their family, but also by themselves of what they were doing in their changing diet as well, and wanting to send their children to school or wanting to provide and save for a better future. They also discussed how management of money was an issue and wanting something they wanted to continue to learn more. And I think that's an issue that we all want to learn more about. They have budgeting classes in these three cooperatives that I discussed, but a lot of them wanted to learn more as well. And so many of them also have just hopes and goals for the future, and that's what these classes that they're participating in, as well as think a broad vision of what's capable for them in the future. Okay. And then lastly, just changing concerns for the women. They discussed how they shifted from just smaller daily concerns of where their next meal was coming from to these larger concerns of wanting to be involved in their community and wanting to create positive change there. They were also concerned about future customers and what that might look like for the future, and for maybe the need of having to do more side businesses or hustles as well, and being able to manage work and deadlines that came with that. And they were also nervous about, as they continue to grow both socially and economically, the added pressure that came both within their family, their community, as well as the pressure that they would put on themselves. And so what I just learned from this was truly wherever, in whatever situation you are, the women, as well as in our own lives, we're going to be put in instances that are going to, we're going to have to like adapt and grow as well. And so lastly, just some of the recommendations that I will continue to research, and what I think also I'd love to discuss more is just those last two views. I kind of focused, there was a lot on that communitarian and networks of what was available to these women, more the institutions and the synergy that happens. And so what are the institutions within a country or community that allow cooperatives, and specifically women artisan cooperatives and entrepreneurs, to be more successful than maybe operating on their own, as well as for practitioners, what would enable successful cooperatives to be more successful, even through a pandemic. You know, a lot of these women had been on their own maybe before, and maybe had relied upon the artisan sector, and they'd been only relying upon tourism. And so obviously tourism was greatly impacted during the COVID pandemic. So they wanted to figure out how they could enhance and create digital platforms to sell their products and enhance those networks as well. And then lastly, I just felt like when you go to a store and when you're looking at a product, I now always look to see where that's coming. And so I'm always curious of like who that product comes from, and like how it impacts that person, especially artisan goods. And so what I noticed here is a lot of we need to determine where those products are coming from, because what I saw here was the impact and positive change, both positively as well as negatively impacts, but what it was doing for women versus having a lone artisan trying to compete and just being paid for piecework. That I was told a lot about, and I noticed and asked questions about both to the CEOs and the other women of what they could maybe do. So that's kind of a little bit what I shared, but also and was able to understand is just how these networks and what women, how they taught other women, brought them into the cooperative, and because of their connection to each other, allowed them to increase their social capital as well as economic capital through these artisan cooperatives. And so these are some of the women that I was able to work with, what we were doing. But thank you. And what questions do you guys have for me? I may miss some in the chat as well. So.
Great, thanks, Garrett. Very interesting presentation. We'll take some questions from the audience. Feel free to either raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, or you can post in the chat. And if you're not in a position to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself, feel free just to indicate that in the chat, and I'll be happy to read it out on your behalf. So perhaps a good place to start, Garrett, would be with a big picture question. Now that you've finished your research, you can reflect on how it went, and perhaps a good question is, what drew you to the concept of social capital? Like, why did you come to find the concept, and why did you use it in your research? What did you think it would be able to do for you, and what do you think it would illuminate and help to uncover in your research context?
Yeah, so I hope I know I touched on it a little bit, but what I noticed when I was doing volunteer work and other research within East Africa, I noticed a lot of lone artisans, maybe in different artisan markets, and they were like selling maybe the exact same products. And so then I was then introduced to these cooperatives, and so I saw a lot of them. They had been in those own situations, and then they banded together. So they that social connection that they'd had from the person they were selling items next to, or their friends or family. Through that social connection, they're like, hey, we should combine efforts, we should train each other. And so I think that is what drew me to the idea of social capital versus simply just seeing them as an economic, but those social connections they had allowed them to enhance their skills, allow them to gain access to some of these cooperatives that they wouldn't have gained access to before. So I noticed many of the women were like, yeah, I like referred my friend to like work here, or was able to like bring her on in the whole process. And so I think in the future, what I saw and what I see this both in the artisan sector and other sectors is what are those connections that we have? How do those bridge us not only within our local community, but to an international and a broader community? So these beautiful products that are being made in the artisan sector, how are we helping these women, already the groups and connections that they're forming, but how are we expanding their market reach and access to other people like us that may be interested in buying?
Yeah, I can see that how that's really important, because we tend to focus on the individual so often. We focus on how the individual needs to start a business, needs to get an education, needs to do this or that. But of course, what we understand through social capital is that it's not just about what the individual does on their own, but it's also about how individuals come together and work together, share resources, share ideas, share social connections. And that ultimately, that's really what drives success, is those social aspects that are captured in the concept of social capital that tend to be overlooked, if you don't think about it. Of course, we all do it every day without thinking about it, but I guess the concept of social capital can help us to understand just what does bring about better outcomes in that context. So there is a question. Marianne has her hand up. Feel free to unmute yourself, Marianne, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, hi, I'm Marianne Castle. I'm in New York City. I'm working on a project trying to get funding for a very similar project in a very rural, impoverished district in Malawi. And I found this very interesting. I unfortunately came a little late, so I will listen to your recording tomorrow. But I found this to be a fantastic description of how you can establish a cooperative. But I have a couple of questions. Were the husbands or male heads of households resistant? Did they take the pay that these women had made from their work? Because that's a common thing in Africa and elsewhere, so that it doesn't allow them to make decisions about the use of the money. Did that at all happen in either country?
Yeah, so a lot of the women, some of them discussed that they faced that their husbands would directly want the money, as well as others discussed like in Imani, they specifically, not only did they do financial training, but they kind of discussed like, hey, like creating your own bank account and what you could do to be able to maybe mediate and discuss finances with your husband. But yeah, that was one concern of them thinking that the money would just be simply theirs to be used for whatever, versus the women having full autonomy and control over it.
So they were given money, they were not giving any kind of something that they could buy food or school uniforms for their kids, something like that. They were actually paid in salaries.
Yeah, they were paid in salary.
So did you do any work? Did they do any work in the communities, talking to heads of households or husbands about the benefits of their wives working and actually, keeping part of the money for their own decisions and using it for children rather than for the chief of the,
yeah. So Imani collective, both in the village and in the main town, they did a lot of family events, and they'd invite the families to be able to come participate and understand what they were doing there. And then it was during those opportunities that they provided kind of education of helping them be like to be used with that. As well as in Rwanda, I noticed a lot of the women shared how they were trying to, if they bring their husbands or other members of their family to work, they are better able to understand like actually the skill that it takes to be able to do that, and just allow them to like have more autonomy.
Good, thank you, yeah. Have you published this information somewhere? I would like to read your work.
Yeah, so I published two. The first one was just over this the Chief Entrepreneurship Founders. It's actually that same title, Weaving Social Capital, of my presentation. And then I published specifically on the food and diet side of this as well. So.
Okay. Tristan, can you give us the publications so that I can get them and read them? The names, list them.
Yeah, sure can. Or perhaps, Garrett, if they're handy, you could post them in the chat if they're handy.
That would be great. Yeah.
Or we could include them in the follow-up email as well that goes out. We could include links to them, perhaps. Probably easy as well. So there is a question in the chat from Najia, who asks what definition of social capital you use for your approach and what sort of paradigm for your study.
Yeah, so let me go back. Beginning.
So I know you made reference to Michael Woolcock's distinction between 4 different approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think like from what I looked at, a lot of there's different areas that social capital is focusing upon, both of the views, but what I aligned with was those 4 views of communitarian, networks, institutional, and synergy, just because it helped frame specifically in the cooperative idea of not just seeing themselves as individuals, but then expanding from individuals to their individual communities, these individual cooperatives, in a sense, that were community. And so that was kind of the paradigm, I guess, that you could say I use an approach, as well as just specifically, I guess, definition-wise of social capital, similar to what was shared there, is just what are the economic gain that happen because an individual benefits that are derived specifically from my connection to this individual. And so in this case, these women, what were the benefits, both socially and economically, that they gained from being connected to the neighbor that helped refer them to wanting to be a part of the cooperative?
Yeah, great. And I guess Nadia, maybe Nadia is interested in, who are the key authors that you cited for the meaning of social capital? You know, did you look at Eleanor Ostrom, for example, if you're interested in this sort of economic focus? Who are the key scholars?
Yeah, it's in the article. I just remember Wilcock and Aaron, but I know like there were some early scholars that I really would have to look at.
Yeah, no, hard question to ask. So I think, because interestingly, like the 4 views of social capital, I think the author's intent there was to say that social capital has been conceptualized in these different ways, you know, to have different meanings or to focus on different aspects of what social capital is or what it does.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really interesting that you've adopted that, because from my point of view, each of those views tends to illuminate something a little bit different in the actual real world. And so, of course, the communitarian view that tends to focus on norms and trust and within networks and so forth, you know, that view illuminates certain things, whereas if you're just purely looking at networks, then that will illuminate something different. So I guess maybe this is a hard question, but like, you know, what led you to that view, and then how useful was it in the way that you did your research?
Yeah, so I think what I had looked at specifically from like an artisan sector point of view, a lot of the research or just like understanding had focused upon specifically just economic. And so from what my experience, what I viewed was a lot of these social connections really like expanded, and a lot of what was there. And I also, one of the studies that kind of like I guess went off of was Dole and Adame. They specifically looked at cooperatives an artisan cooperative in Uganda, and what they lacked, and a lot of what they lacked was they had joined together as individuals and groups, but that was like their limitation because of where they were at, because of location, and so they lacked the networks to be able to expand outside of their community. So I noticed that a lot of these artisans had amazing products, but they lacked the network and connection to be able to expand outside just their individual community. And so that's kind of like where I fell into Woolcockinarians of that view of looking more of just not only within individual community, but expanding to bridging the gap to through different networks to broader worldwide community.
Yeah, for sure. So are there any other questions? Anybody else have any comments you'd like to make or questions for Garrett? Feel free to post in the chat, or you could either raise your hand or even just simply unmute yourself and ask a question if you like. Thanks for posting the link to the article, Garrett, just seeing that come up in the chat. Yeah. I'll make sure that goes out in the follow-up email as well.
Are these 2 cooperatives or 4 cooperatives still going on? Are they still doing well?
Yeah. So all the cooperatives, both in Kenya and Rwanda, they're still operating. And then even from the CEOs, because I wasn't able to visit 2 of those cooperatives. So like the one that teaches women skills, I believe they were in their 4th cohort, and like they've expanded to like they built like a whole new center and everything, which is really cool for them. As well as the other one, they've been able to expand their access to women as well as other artisans within the country. So I didn't share in this, but like when I went for Amani, they have a location in Turkana, Kenya. And so I was able to visit that location because that was like really new for them. So they were able to again expand outside of where they were.
Did they do their own? Did the women do their own marketing of the products, or was there a marketer, a person who actually helped them and to develop the network so that they could go on after the learning period ended?
Yeah, so for different ones, and so for like example, Imani, they do have somebody that's specifically hired for both in-country and international sales as well. But then for some of the smaller ones, the CEOs were largely in charge of that. Or the ones in Rwanda, I know the women themselves will be in charge of kind of marketing products, both like social media wise, or both when individuals will come specifically to their sites to buy them.
I have other questions, but I don't think it's totally related to the theory of social capital, but I think it affects it because this project I'm working on is really aiming to sort of elevate the standard of living, not just with the women who participate as a tailoring program, but the communities, which are basically family agriculture and fairly impoverished. So would it be any opportunity to talk to you about your experience there? Because I think it would be valuable for this particular organization that's helping in Malawi, which is really a poor country. And we're also thinking, I think that it will have health and other educational benefits, the cooperative itself, just as you described.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'll include my personal email because I'm in the period of transition to a new role.
That would be,
and so yeah, for sure, email, and I'd love to set up a time shot.
Thank you. Thank you, Tristan. This is fantastic.
All right, so
thanks, Marianne. Go ahead, Shirley.
I ask a question because I was wondering how you dealt with in your research the fact that people give socially acceptable answers, because that is a kind of a cultural trait in Rwanda.
Yeah, so yeah, like I could see that at different times of them just providing answers that may have, yeah, again, that socially acceptable. What I think allowed me to gain a better understanding, and also allowed me to get some of those deeper conversations and deeper questions. Were two things is I had good relationships with both of the cooperatives I was there, both when I'd done previous volunteer service as well as research within these countries. So I already kind of like knew these women and what they were doing. And so they were more willing to share. And then lastly, so like I think that allowed them to be more willing to share with me versus like a complete stranger. But then I also had in each of these settings, I had a facilitator who, if women chose to speak in Kinyarwandan or Swahili, they could go through that woman translator and facilitator, and then they would tell me. And so it was more operating through the facilitator. So I never operated any of the activities. I simply was more of an observant, and then the facilitator would help take notes and then tell me what was going on if it was not spoken in English. And I specifically emphasized that they were women rather than just like someone else that could just translate, because I wanted them to feel more comfortable, as well as they knew who that person was, so they had felt more comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's great. We've also been involved with groups of women, and just teaching them kind of very simple things like you can work together with your husband to do, you know, a small business like raise a pig or so. They were like, oh, can I? You know, oh, really? And it also improved their marriage, because they were taught that the husband should bring everything and that the wife should just stay at home and, you know, wait for or ask for what they needed. And so, yeah, it was really quite interesting to listen to those testimonies. And in the training, we also have a training called GALS, Gender Action Learning System. And in this training, they also bring people from the community or like husband stakeholders into the group. And they raise issues showing that some of the situations or relationships are not fair, you know, like they show it up that women are basically second-class citizens, sort of thing. And then because of the pressure of the group, they have to kind of consider, you know, whether they're still going to do that or change. So that is also an interesting type of way of influencing the situations that are going on. Yeah. Improve.
I think like what you shared, like a lot of that education and training, not only helping the women understand, but then the community. And so some of these cooperatives were doing some of those educational programs for community as well, which is really, it's important so that they can understand and help change policy, change cultural norms, I guess, that maybe.
Yeah, oh, great. Good research.
Yeah, it is really good research. So any other questions? Any final questions that you might have? Now is your time. Well, certainly very interesting to hear about your research, Garrett, and congratulations on finishing your PhD as well. It's a major milestone and great to hear. And it sounds like we've made some connections here within the audience as well, for people who can connect after this event and perhaps get some more information, have some more discussions about this really interesting topic.
Sure.
So let's wrap it up. Looks like there aren't any other questions. Although there is one in the chat just now asking if it's possible for you to share your thesis. I don't know if that's available for people.
Yeah, so these two came from, but I'll find out if it's yet public on my university's website. It may still be on hold as well, so I'll find out.
Yeah, if you can perhaps let me know. Again, I can include that in the follow-up email if it is available or not, just so participants know that. So again, thanks, Garrett. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks. Next week is the association's AGM. In 2 weeks, we have a webinar on healthcare network governance and accountability shaped by social capital. So details about that are available on our website, the International Social Capital Association's website. And of course, everyone can be thinking about what they're going to present at our 2026 conference. We've recently announced there'll be an International Social Capital Conference in February of 2026 in Dubai. So we've put an early expression of interest up on the website for that. And I guess some, start thinking about what you might like to present and whether you can attend in person in Dubai. So yeah, let's wrap it up. Thanks, Garrett. Thanks everyone for taking part. Look forward to interacting with all of you again in future.
Thank you.
Very much. Good night.